So I'll do a soft start while colleagues hopefully continue to join. So just to introduce myself, I'm Nick Shepherd. So I'm Open Research Advisor based in the Research Services team in the library at the University of Leeds. As I say, we do keep these sessions open to the wider community. I've spotted one colleague external to Leeds from Cambridge, but I think the majority of colleagues on the call today are from Leeds, which is, I think, is understandable in terms of what we're talking about, which is the Open Research Champions, the DoRIs acting as Open Research Champions, which was an initiative we launched back in November. So this is what I'm planning to cover today. I'll do a quick introduction. In fact, I already am. And give you a little bit of context about this activity before handing over to my colleague Kikachukwu, whose explicit role is to support the DoRIs in their role as Open Research Champions. So she will be talking to you a little bit about that. And then very pleased to welcome Dr. Myles Gould, who is the DoRI for the School of Geography, who'll be talking about research methodologies in geography, in that as a specific school and discipline. And then we'll hear from Dr. Roger Beecham, who is also, I think, in the School of Geography. Correct me if I'm wrong, Roger, but you're also the DoRI for LIDA, which is the Leeds Institute for Data Analytics, and he'll be talking about open science in data-driven social science. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for a bit of Q&A and an open discussion. So like to keep these fairly informal. Do continue. I might not always see the chat depending on what time I'm doing. If I'm talking, I can see there's one message there at the moment. But if you've got any questions as we go, anything occurs to you, please do comment in the chat or ask a question in the chat, and we'll pick those up hopefully at the end before we close at 2 o'clock. So I'm preempting my slides, that's what that says. So yeah, do please ask any questions as we go. Just to reiterate that we are being recorded, so you are welcome to come on the mic if you're happy to do so to ask a question, but just do bear in mind that we are being recorded. Please use the Q&A feature. We're not using that today, just use the chat feature just to ask any questions, and I'll try to field those towards the end if we've got a little bit of time. So as I say, just before I do hand over to Kikachukwu, I wanted to give a little bit of context around this work. As I say, hopefully if you've read the description of what this event's about, it's following on from our launch of the Open Research Champions Network back in November, when it was very cold, actually. It's very hot today, so that might be a reason we don't get many people here. I'd prefer to be outside in the sun. I think we're up to 25. But it was freezing cold in November when we had the launch event for the network, and also the Open Research Hub, which I'll mention in a moment. But I just wanted to emphasise, I think one of the things that perhaps Kikachukwu will pick up on a little bit as we go as well is that for many colleagues, as the conversations we have around the university, sometimes open research people naturally think of open access, and that's understandable. Open access is, of course, a part of open research, an important part of open research, and it's a bit of a behemoth, if you like, in terms of all the compliance issues around REF, etc. So people tend to, gravitate towards discussions around open access. But what we're really trying to emphasise is that I'm just going to get rid of that chat at the bottom. It's going to be wait. Is that open research is much broader than open access, and this little snippet there is taken from the University of Leeds Research Culture Strategic Plan, which you can find online. There's a link there. Or Google it. I'll post some links in the chat when I finish speaking. And that sort of emphasises that open research practices strive for collaborative working, sharing and openness throughout the entire research cycle to enable transparency, reproducibility and the reduction of inequalities. So that's a knowledge equity perspective, which I'll come on to as well, whilst maximising the reach of our research. So that's sort of a succinct description of what it's all about. The graphic on the right-hand side is from UNESCO. As they refer to open science, we tend in the UK and certainly at least to open research to be more inclusive of the humanities. Similar principles apply. But open access would fit in that top quadrant in terms of open scientific knowledge, along with things like open data, open educational resources, etc. But I quite like this graphic because it also emphasises other aspects of open research, such as open science infrastructures. Proprietary ownership of infrastructure can be a significant barrier to open research. Open engagement of societal actors, so that's things like citizen science, which may or may not be relevant in different disciplines, and open dialogue with other knowledge systems. So again, that's where the knowledge equity aspect comes in, and some of the issues again, in the context of open access, actually being able to access or publish research in the global south, for example, is an important part of what we're talking about. So that's kind of the context that we're coming at it from. Just to emphasise as well that it comes under the broader umbrella of research culture across the sector, and certainly here at Leeds as well. So there's lots of intersecting sort of conversations and resources around open research. So we've got an open research statement, which again, I'll post some links in a moment. These are active links if I'll share the slides on the blog later. Which outlines what the university's commitment to open research is. We've also got a publications policy, which underpins that open research statement. That's quite a detailed document, but you'll find reference in there to open access, of course, and the use of symplectic and Row, the White Rose Research Online Repository. Things like rights retention. Again, I'd be interested if colleagues, let me know in the chat if you don't know what rights retention is, because we've got a bit of a job at the moment to sort of communicate what some of the issues are around rights retention and how that relates to open access. There will be more comms coming around about that, or you can look it up in the publications policy. Also refers to things like data access statements to make sure that data's available from published research, and use of credit. So this is crediting all contributors in different contexts to a research output, essentially. So that's all I've detailed on the publications policy. Already touched on knowledge equity. So again, there's lots of different aspects to that, but again, just to emphasize in the context of open access, the problems with subscription and paywalls and the APC model, historically perhaps academic colleagues in the global south couldn't afford to subscribe to research outputs. Now, increasingly, they can't afford to publish research outputs thanks to the APC model. So that's a huge challenge to knowledge equity. And then that comes into things like the Declaration of Research Assessment, or DoRA, which emphasises, there's issues around research culture in terms of how we focus on impact factor, journal impact factor as a proxy for research quality, etc., and the costs associated with that. So many may know the costs it costs, the amount of money it costs to publish in Nature, for example, as a high impact journal, about £9,000, which is obviously inequitable amongst many other things. Lots of different resources there. So I've just highlighted, for example, the Research Culture Uncovered podcast, which covers all sorts of different aspects of research culture. I contribute in the context of open research, but also with other colleagues around research integrity, research impact, PGR support and careers, etc. Then just very quickly to emphasise the Open Research Hub. So this is, again, was launched as part of the event last year in November. Which you can find online. If you haven't had a look, please do. And it's a hub. It's intended to point to resources elsewhere around the university, including the library. We're the people to talk to about open access and research data, for example, but there's other colleagues involved in other stakeholders and colleagues around the university involved in different aspects of open research. So that was the intention behind that. Lots of challenges involved in sort of putting that together. The sheer volume of resources, which we should endorse and signpost. And again, that'd be interesting to talk to colleagues in different disciplines, what sort of tools you use. Do you use preprint servers? Do you use the Open Science Framework? Things like Octopus, you may or may not have heard of, which is another tool for open research. And then the other thing that's perhaps particularly relevant today is the challenge around disciplinary differences, which is one of the motivations behind the Open Research Champions project with DoRIs in the context of their expertise in their disciplines, because obviously I'm a generalist, as many of my colleagues in the library are, and we can't possibly know the ins and outs of the specifics of a specific discipline, whether that's STEM, arts and humanities, or social sciences, or research methodologies, whether it's quantitative, qualitative, participatory action research, or citizen science, for example, and all the relevant different tools and services. So that's kind of a big motivation behind the champions issue. I'm just aware of time, so I won't dwell on these, but if you're probably aware of the library calendar, and so there's a couple of upcoming events that you can register for, and you're very welcome to do so. And as I say, I'll take questions at the end as well. Okay, so I'll stop sharing for now and hand over to you, Kikachukwu, if that's okay.
Thank you, Nick. Hi, everyone. I am Kikachukwu, as Nick mentioned, and I'm an open research advisor tasked with supporting the DoRIs in their roles as a research champion. So I'm very, very particular about abbreviation. So in case you don't know what DoRIs mean, it's Directors of Research and Innovation, for anyone who might not be sure. Today, I'm just going to be talking about supporting open research through collaborating with the Directors of Research and Innovation in their role as open research champions. I'm just going to try to share my slides. Hopefully it works.
Let me know if you're struggling. I've got access to them, I think, if you want me to share.
Yeah, I think I've got it.
There you go.
Can you see it?
Yep. Not in presentation mode yet, so we can see them on the left-hand side, but if you just start, that's great, yeah.
Okay. So I have a couple of topics to talk about today, just 5 brief topics. And I'm going to be starting with the objectives we've got. So first, just to mention that the Directors of Research and Innovation are the center of advocacy for open research within the schools. You might wonder why we've chosen the DoRIs to be the center for these efforts. And it came about from the need to raise awareness of open research and understanding disciplinary differences. And this was a need that was identified by the Open Research Group as part of its strategic aims. In October 2021, the university's Research and Innovation Board endorsed the formation of the Open Research Group as a subgroup of the Research Culture Group. And its formation is in line with the university's strategic objectives. And these objectives promote strengthening and refining the research practices and culture of the university. So that being said, this Open Research Group identified 4 themes that would help to enable open research. And that would include raising awareness for open research, fair attribution, improving access to the University of Leeds research outputs, and also refining training in a manner that would benefit the entire institution. So these 4 themes have sort of spelled out the responsibilities of the DoRIs and what it is we do when we go in to advocate within the schools. So for us, open research advocates, we go in with the objectives of raising awareness, of course, and also more importantly, to listen to and understand the challenges facing the adoption of open research practices in a discipline-specific way, because we understand now that it differs from school to school, and also to provide practical guidance for integrating open research principles. We also want feedback because we find that that really helps in deciding the kind of outputs that we want to put out for researchers and any other colleague. I've added shots of our university goals and strategy. So we have the forward plan, which positions the library as a leader in open research. And we also have the strategic objectives 3, which enables or supports the enabling of open research practices across the institution. On to my next topic, very quickly, understanding disciplinary differences. We believe in the library that the practice of making open research processes and outputs should be freely accessible, but then it should also be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And this is the foundation on which we went out to have these conversations with the Directors of Research and Innovation, who are really central in our venture to create awareness, understanding that it's not necessarily the most acceptable thing to everyone, as everyone has, all researchers have a way that they carry out their own research. So it might be brand new to some people, and it might be something that they're familiar with. Either way, we expected some sort of curiosity. We were hoping that the conversations with the DoRIs would help us to focus on the specific barriers that affect them as a discipline, and that it would help us, create a more efficient process in advocating for open research, as well as really good resources that would help with that. And so going into the schools and meeting the DoRIs individually demonstrated our own desire to diversify our own generalist perception, which Nick often says that we are generalists, in fact. So they are the ones who have more of an understanding of what goes on in there. So this really demonstrated our own need to diversify that perception, as we are really eager to help researchers to engage with open research practices to the best that they can within their disciplines. and also eager to share our services with them while sort of rebranding and making it more specific to their needs instead of giving them the more generalist approach to open research. Choosing the DoRIs would mean that it's really excellent in that the DoRIs are already leaders in research and integrity and even environment. So they are really well positioned to influence research culture within their schools, and their disciplinary expertise or perspective would help us to tailor the resources that we're trying to create for them. For determining the common barriers, there were sometimes not common barriers, but now we have a few. They would range from funding to time and maybe much more, as well as, individual interest, whether or not the researcher is interested in open research or would like to carry on the traditional way. However, I did create a report after meeting with about 39 DoRIs, and we were able to confirm that from the things that were being said to us, we did need to create more of an awareness across the schools, starting from the beginning. So there is this perception that open research is open access, instead of the correct understanding that open access is only an aspect of open research. So open research is a really big umbrella that contains open access, open data, open software, and the likes. And we are doing these advocacy sessions to correct that perspective so that everyone's engaging correctly, not thinking that open access is the beginning and the end of things. We also realize that there needs to be sort of emerge for terminologies, especially because when you go into certain disciplines, you find that they are in fact practicing open research, but the issue is we don't identify it the way they do. So this is their daily practice, but we would probably identify it as something else. So possibly in health, where they register various protocols, we already call that pre-registration, but we didn't know about things like that. So we got to know through those conversations with them as well. And we also figured we need a community of practice where everyone can get together and sort of just put everything out and discuss their challenges, discuss the benefits to open research. I think that that really helps our researchers to sort of have conversations and depend on each other, because then they can hear each other's experiences, whether it's bad or good. I think that all the facts should be out there for everyone. So we needed a community of practice and, a place where we can also advertise our resources so that everyone is aware, again, pointing to creating awareness. As we progressed, we also created or started to have initiatives to raise awareness. And raising awareness for us came with starting with the consultations with colleagues at the remit of our open research champions. So we started to reach out to our open research champions, the DoRIs, to say, hi, we would like you to create the space for us to have these conversations. And so we started going in and having conversations about open research and listening to, other than the DoRIs, other researchers or other colleagues as well who might be interested in sharing opinions or, giving us suggestions. And we have figured that we would like to do this in two ways. So we would like to do the meetings with more senior researchers, and then maybe in a larger assembly by the end of the year towards fall, where we can get everyone together to talk about it with more time on our hands. And the second initiative that we have to raise awareness would be the merge with the UKRN at Leeds. So the UKRN at Leeds was a Microsoft Teams space that was, for UKRN alone, that's the UK Reproducibility Network, where they talked about more UKRN-centered opportunities. But UKRN already practices open research, so we saw an advantage where we could come together to create a bigger space to talk about things beyond open access and reproducibility, and talk about more aspects to open research in general. And we think that this would really help with wider application of open research across the school. So our The name of our new community of practice is Leeds UK Reproducibility Network and Open Research Community, to reflect the merge and reflect the joint efforts of both communities. Just for today, I have put, I forget the name, but I have put a code for everyone to scan. If you would like to join the open research community, please feel free to scan this code. This is a Leeds specific open research community. So if you are within the institution, please feel free to scan the code and join when Nick sends the slides to everyone. So further to initiatives that raise awareness, the UK Reproducibility Network is an organization that the University of Leeds joined in 2024, and it's now part of many other universities who are a part of it. And it is intended to give participants more knowledge on open research. One of the ways that they are doing this is through the Open Research Program, which is supposed to encourage the uptake of open research practices all around. So they are doing this through 5 various strands. One would be the train the trainer, the second, evaluation, third, sharing and integrating, management and sustainability, and open, responsible reward and recognition. So the train the trainer is something that we've started doing within the institution. And we have about 8 members who are learning various things about open research, and will go out to share that information as well. I've added 2 more codes for case studies. So the UK Reproducibility Network provides case studies of its own for any discipline you might be interested in. So please do feel free to scan that and take a look at it. We also have our University of Leeds case studies as well, done by 2 members of the university who did, I think, very amazing work. The case studies don't necessarily represent best practice, but they reflect the experiences of practitioners in a real world event. We also have the Open Research Hub for raising awareness. This is our one-stop shop for all things open research, and it provides resources that speak to all stages of the research cycle while linking to other external platforms that can greatly enable your engagement with open research. You will find more links on the tools and resources page, and special thanks to Nick and Emily for all the work they put into it. This hub provides more general information. As you know, Nick has said, we are generalists, but we are working really hard to tailor the materials to specific disciplines or even to specific methodologies as we see fit eventually. For us, the next steps would be increasing awareness through targeted advocacy sessions, collaborating with research support across campus, and also resource development, whether it's training, whether it's other kinds of materials as well. We are looking at documenting more good practice across the faculties and creating discipline-specific training. And we recognize that long-term open research requires leadership from within the disciplines. But I just want to point out that it's not just for the leaders alone. It's about strengthening what we care about, which is credible and rigorous and meaningful research. So it may not look like it is a norm yet, but culture does take time to shift, and we think that it will shift. So no matter how small, I would like to encourage everyone to be more involved in open research. You're not just complying with something, you are helping to shape a better research culture. I think that's the end of my presentation today. Thank you all.
Great, thanks very much, Kikachukwu. So without further ado, I'll hand on to you, Myles, if that's okay.
Yeah, can everyone hear me? I'm just sharing my slides.
Yeah, I can see your slides and I can hear you.
Oh, you can see my slides. Oh, that was really quick.
Oh, they've gone again.
They've gone again. Okay, that must be me not clicking. Okay, let me check. That might be. Oh, there we go. Share again.
Yeah.
There might be a bit of a delay. Can you see the slides now?
We can, not yet in presentation mode. I can see. There you go. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Nick and Kikachukwu for the invitation to come and talk today on thinking about open research within the context of geography, and that's important in terms of the range of work that's done within the school. More on that in a moment. I thought it might be useful to give a little bit of a bio, very, very briefly, about me. So I'm obviously here as a DoRI, Director of Research and Innovation, and also as the champion within the school for open research. I have previously been a research cluster leader for one of our 4 research clusters within the school. And in that role previously was a member of the previous Geography Unit of Assessment REF group in preparation for the 2021 REF panel. I thought just also say that a long time ago, my first lecturing post was actually in an NHS R&D support unit in health services research at the time when sort of systematic reviews and clinical effectiveness was gathering a lot of momentum. So that I was just thinking about this the other day and the sort of links to open research. So it's sort of reminding me of an early part of the career before I came to Leeds in the very late 1990s. At one stage, I also had a secondment, which was really useful at the NHS Information Centre, which is now, I think, well, it was part of NHS Digital. I can't quite keep up to date with what's happening with NHS Digital in the restructuring of the NHS England and some of that stuff being subsumed back into the government department, where we're sort of interfacing with the government statistical service and was involved in part about how some of the products are sort of disseminated in the wider world, and also the press and liaising on how press releases relate to that within the organisation, and also ensuring and things like that. I just want to quickly say a little bit about my research background. So I'm definitely a social scientist. I'm definitely a geographer. I'm interested in population and health geography. At the moment, the sort of big areas of research that I'm involved in look at residential population movement, perceived self-reported illness. I have a long track record of using secondary data analysis, but I do other types of research methodologies as well. And all of this is sort of a wider interest about how geography matters for, let's say, residential movement or population health outcomes. Is it the composition of areas that matter when we look for geographical differences, or is it the difference that places make? Is a recurrent theme throughout my research. And in terms of how I do my research, a lot of my research involves using secondary data analysis, whether that be, for example, I'll use one example, the census data, but I have a lot of experience, and I'll talk about this briefly later on, of working in sort of controlled data laboratories within the civil service, accessing individual census records that have been linked together over time. And I'll talk about some of the limitations that poses when we think about open research in some respects. I'm sort of very much trained in the exploratory data analysis tradition as well. And I have particular expertise over the whole length of my career in something called multi-level statistical modeling. I won't say a lot about that as well, but I have other interests in research design. I just thought that might be useful to sort of position where I'm coming from as an individual researcher. But of course, I have overall responsibility for researchers within a school that's extremely diverse. I'll say more about that in a few moments. I do want to just briefly say a little bit about me and giving this talk. I do perhaps feel a little bit of imposter syndrome today. I'm not an expert in open research. Yes, I've met with Kikachukwu and Nick are coming. I'm very, very pleased after one of the meetings I had with Kikachukwu in the autumn, are coming to help us think more about it in the context of the school, and particularly in our School Research Innovation Committee next month. And I thank them both for the support that they're providing me and the school and other schools. So I am on a steep learning curve, but I recognise that I have some knowledge and I need to know more, but I have some thoughts as well, and I hope that's going to be useful today. And one of the first things I would like to sort of acknowledge is I think we do need to be, as colleagues have already alluded to today, we need to be realistic and pragmatic. And we need to be careful about avoiding a one-size-fits-all, particularly in the context of my department, of my school, as I'll say in a moment. And I think we also have to recognise that since I joined the profession, the world has changed a lot. I think I stepped back and have been thinking about this in the build-up to giving this short talk today about the change in the research environment and how universities' missions have been transformed in an internet age. So I sort of think about how I was initially trained and how things weren't particularly accessible and how things are becoming more and more accessible, and we need to do more about that in the future. But as we've already alluded to today, we do need to acknowledge different our research and innovation contexts, and that results in the situation where different projects or different outputs or different work packages are sometimes more amenable to certain open research practices than others. And we mustn't forget that that doesn't preclude that other research within the context of my school is also equally important and is just important to our project. But yes, we're definitely on a journey of wanting to increase accessibility of our research to all. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but we are quite a diverse school, and we are very focused on research focused on global challenges. And as I've listed the 4 different research clusters, so we do span the full environmental science through to data science, social sciences, through to humanities. And I've listed there that we do actually have some grants from all 5 of those research councils spanning those different disciplines on the slate for the school, as it were, at the moment. But we cover the sort of full gambit from river basins to flooding and water, through to climate change and ecology and global change, through to data analytics in the urban setting, through to looking at inequalities, through to thinking about social justice, citizenship, and cities. So it's very, very diverse as a school. And similarly, our researchers and our postgraduates do all sorts of different research approaches through, full field observations and experimentation. There's a typo on there, I apologise. And laboratory analysis through to simulation, statistical modelling, visualization. Roger, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that perhaps shortly. But we also have lots of people, including myself, doing secondary data analysis. I tend to use statistical data, but we have people who use Earth observation. We've had PGRs who've included systematic reviews in parts of their PhDs. We've got researchers that are doing ethnography, interviews, participant observations. We've got lots of expertise and researchers doing action research. And we've got some people doing discourse analysis of pre-existing sort of secondary text, as it were, and doing policy analysis. So we do the full gambit within the school. And I think we do need to recognise that we would like to do and like to deposit more open access data sets and codes where it's possible to do that, but it's not always possible. Some of our postgraduate researchers are coming from different territories where some of the data sets come with particular confidentiality rules or rules about that sharing. So we're conscious and acknowledge that. So I think we do need to be really careful about sort of blanket approaches to doing this. And it may not be appropriate in every single situation for every particular project or output to be dealt with in exactly the same way, although we aspire, obviously, to do more of this. And some of the things we're thinking about, yes, we want to do more open research, and we're on a journey. And we have some colleagues that are more expert in this already. Roger's much more knowledgeable than myself, for example. But we do want to be working towards developing and enhancing the accessibility of our research, the use of our research. And we've done lots of work in enhancing our impact. I know our research manager and impact manager, Pazit's in the audience today as well. So we're on a journey. And we're very ambitious. We did very well in the previous REF, for example, but we have more ambition going forwards. We want our research to be as transparent as possible when that's possible, and sometimes that's not always possible in terms of the limitations of publishing journal articles, in terms of tight limits on the amount of pages or words that you're allowed for certain outputs. But I do think it's really important as part of this journey in transparency that, you know, including myself, upping the game in terms of the detail that we can give about our research methodologies within our papers, for example. And so we also I do recognize the importance of supporting colleagues who have topics and research that are amenable to OR or to open research, but we also similarly must also acknowledge that sometimes it's not amenable to open research, and how we support those researchers as well. There are, of course, implications for the next REF, and we're thinking very carefully about that. And we will need to be writing about what we're doing about open research in our people, culture, and environment statement as well. And I'm sort of conscious that colleagues are busy doing the research, doing the impact, doing the dissemination, and they're busy and time pressured. So we need to think about ways that we make this easier or help to support people in doing that. So the things we've been sort of thinking about is the possibility of using preprints as a way of doing some additional preliminary dissemination of research findings before research papers are published in, let's say, journal outlets and monographs. And it makes me think back to, in fact, we had a very loved working paper series within the school that died over time. And it's interesting that sort of maybe preprints is a replacement for that sort of history of working papers that perhaps I used at the early stages of my career. So we're beginning to think more about that. We're doing work to place data in repositories where it's appropriate and possible. So for an example I think of quite quickly is the involvement of the ESRC-funded Consumer Data Research Centre that is led by geographers here at Leeds, and that they have a depository for some of the data sets that they can share in the public domain, because not all of their data sets can be, because of the licensing agreements in terms of the work that was done in the CDRC. PASIT has been passionate about launching a research briefing series, and I know that sometimes PASIT is a real enthusiast and is probably frustrated by that. Sometimes it's hard to get colleagues to write those briefings in a different format for different audience to find the time, and we want to do more of that going forward. And colleagues are already in certain situations disseminating code and data depending upon the approaches that they're using, and things like GitHub, and I anticipate seeing more of that in the future. We have co-production and action research in progress. That's something we could perhaps trumpet a bit more. We have some colleagues that do a lot of work in that field, but not all of our colleagues are going to be doing work in that area because of the diversity of the different things that we do within the school. And we need to be thinking about other forms of dissemination, policy briefings, data tools, and dashboards, for example. Can I just have a quick check on time? Nick, should I speak for another 5 minutes, or I just want to just double check where we're at?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to hear from you, Myles. I just
want to make sure I give enough time for Roger.
I haven't actually had much in the way of questions yet, so just another quick call to ask any questions, because if we don't get any questions, we don't need much time at the end. So yeah, please do carry on.
Okay, so I'll just make these next few comments really, really brief. So this is just to flag a sort of a cross-national study that was done with colleagues, led by my colleague Jocelyn Evans in the School of Politics, and involving some myself and colleagues in geography with other colleagues in Europe, where we did a large social survey on radical right voting within the context of four countries. And the UK study is deposited and being used in the UK data service. And I was just looking at the paper this morning to remind myself of how we've made the data of what data and the types of the data available in the project available to a wider audience. I did also want to talk about some work I've worked for a number of years with my colleague Ian Shuttleworth at Queen's University Belfast, where we've been using census microdata, which are individual records that have been linked together over time, but in a controlled data environment where we have to be supervised by civil servants. You go to the room, you're supervised, you do your analysis, they check the analysis, they approve it, and they send it back to Leeds. So I think I need to be reaccredited, but I have a shot there of the Northern Ireland government security badge that I have to wear when I go to the office by appointment. I can get through the first door once I'm let in the building, but I can't even get in the final door. I have to be let in and stripped of my phone, and I can't use my own pens and paper. So what I'm trying to say, I'm sort of over-egging that a little bit, and I'm not going to talk about the example there. There's a lot of quite advanced analysis that's been done about individuals changing over time in the places that they live in, but have to be supervised in a controlled environment. So that means that analysis, once it leaves the laboratory, cannot be reproduced by others. Maybe we could share the code within the secure data environment, but you'd have to be accredited to go there. So I just wanted to raise the point. I've even put the acknowledgements that we're required to put on, and every time I do a presentation and the analysis, because of the way that this data, which is also linked to not what we would call NHS records in England, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, they call health card registration cards in Northern Ireland. So, very privileged to be able to do that analysis, and been really good to do that. But there are such strict controls and having to be accredited that it's not possible to replicate those results. I just wanted to give that as an example. And then something completely different. I just wanted to use this as a very quick point. This is a work that I did with Ian recently. We used the UK Google mobility reports that were sort of made available as a consequence of COVID in different territories to get some feeling. And we did some work looking at this data to have a look. And it's been quite extensively used to look at people who are really good at staying at home during lockdown. But there's a geography to that, or there are patterns to that, because it depends on the sort of profile of the place in terms of the occupational profile. And certain people still had to go to work to do essential jobs, and that's differentiated geographically. And that's not the point I wanted to make. We're using here data that's in the public domain that's been made available. But to write this paper was quite tricky because it's quite difficult to tell people about the nature of this Google mobility reports data, because Google don't tell you very much. So there's a sort of paradox here of using data that's disseminated widely, but you don't actually know a lot about the ins and outs of the data, despite it being used in lots of other publications and sometimes used by other government statistical offices as well. So I just wanted to make that point, that sometimes you want to say more about the data that you're using, but Google are a bit sketchy about it. And we talk a little bit about that and some of the limitations of the data in that paper. And finally, I just wanted to talk about something that we did through the CDRC for the council. And we had a brilliant Owen, I can't remember Owen's surname, who was a data scientist as part of the data scientist partnership program that CDRC and LIDA run, provided a tool for the council that's embedded within the Leeds Observatory that's being used by citizens, that is really for councillors. Every single councillor in Leeds can now use this data dashboard about the census, this particular set of tools, to allow them to access data and information. And that was as a consequence of the data science project and having a data scientist work on that for 6 months to sort of change and enhance how the census is used by ward councillors in Leeds City Council and the citizenships. I also try and encourage my students to use it too. So that's it from me.
Great, thanks very much, Myles. There's lots of stuff there that I'll have to do. Please share your slides, and
I've got to stop sharing. I'll stop sharing.
Oh yeah, you remembered, and I'll pick up. I'd love to pick up on some of those a bit more detail with you at another time. But given time we're on now, I'll pass straight over to you, Roger, if that's okay. Just to acknowledge your question as well, Eric. If we have time, we'll perhaps touch on that, but I'll get in touch with you about that. I think it's a good question and one that I don't necessarily know the answer to, but yeah, I'll definitely pick that up with you.
Great, thanks very much. Hopefully you can see my slides.
It just seems to be waiting. I've got a delay. Can anybody else see them? I've got Roger Beecham has started screen share.
Not quite yet, Roger.
Yeah, it says you're sharing support. Let's try again.
Have I stopped sharing?
I think you have, yeah.
Yes, yeah, don't worry, Myles, it's not your fault. Oh, it worked before.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Is it? Are we in business? Oops. No, it's not, has it? I think I know why. Is it?
No, I can see it. I can
Oh,
see
you can see it.
Yeah.
Brilliant, good stuff. Okay. So thanks very much for the invite, and thanks, Myles, for kind of alluding to some of the stuff that I vaguely knew about in geography, but it was really interesting to hear from you there. So yes, I'm going to talk. I've got a slightly different title than the one I think I originally gave, about some reflections on doing kind of open science research through some of the my own analysis that I do. So like Myles, I'm based in the School of Geography 80% of the time. 20% of the time I'm Director of Research at LIDA. And although I was invited here as in my capacity as Director of Research at LIDA, I'm actually really not going to talk about LIDA that much until right towards the end. So I definitely need to get to that at the end. So I might chuck out a few slides along the way. But hopefully I'm advancing my slides. I am, yes, brilliant. So I do quite a lot of kind of open kind of data-driven research. And
sorry, Roger, have your slides advanced? I can still see your title. I don't think it's just me.
Oh no.
I have to paint a picture with words. I don't know what's going on.
There
you go. Yeah. Sorry. Still.
I think I know what's happened. I've got like a secondary screen that is that I shouldn't have. So
right now I can see two sort of buff boxes with question
marks. How do I exit full screen? I think this might be better. So you should definitely be able to see.
Sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
Good stuff. Okay, yes. So I could have easily talked about each of these kind of concepts on the left and tools on the right for doing kind of open science research. And in geography, actually, there are quite it's expected nowadays that if you're going to produce an empirical data analysis paper, you will be doing things like generating a code repo, certainly putting up preprints, but thinking about kind of making your work transparent with these things. So I'm not actually going to give an overview of these things, although I'll kind of allude to a few of them. But what I really want to ask a question about is, what does good data-driven science look like? And by good, I mean work that's kind of theoretically informed, that's rigorous, that you can defend, because that's what the open science movement is about. And does open science protocols get us there? And I think that's an interesting question to ask when you're doing like applied data analysis, certainly in geography, but I think there are many other applied domains to which we could ask that question for. And I started to kind of think about these things a couple of years ago for a project with the Department for Transport, where we were working on this data set. So this is called Stats 19. Stats 19 is a form that the police fill in every time a road crash happens that results in an injury that then gets reported to the police. So it is the kind of canonical road safety data set in the UK. And it's a great data set. So I've mentioned its population level, that is every crash that's recorded goes in it. But the form goes on a lot. So we know when the crash happened, where it happened. We know loads of context around each road crash. So which road it was on, the class of road, what the conditions were like at the time of the crash in terms of the road and lighting and other environmental context. We know lots of information about the individuals that are involved in the crash, so usually pedestrians being hit by cars, usually. We know lots of things around the drivers that are kind of crashing into these pedestrians. That's typically each observation in the data set. And we know also lots about the vehicle. So it's a really attribute-rich population-level data set, millions of records. And so there are lots of kind of real empirical questions that we can ask and that we were thinking about for this project. And there's also a history of people doing analysis with these data as well. So we were looking at some kind of inequalities in who hit whom, and we had some hypotheses that we were identifying there, particularly to do with inequalities in the characteristics of pedestrians being hit in particular classes of area by drivers from other classes of area. And then we were doing other kind of before-after analysis, looking at the effect of particular classes of intervention on road crashes, net of kind of changes in the amount of traffic and other things. So these were real kind of scientific questions that we were asking on the data set. And so we wanted to do it in a good empirical way. Because we kind of, as part of the project, you know, we do lots of open science things. So we write lots of R packages for some of the kind of grunt work that we're doing on those classes of data and other things. We were constantly conscious of the kind of open science movement. And I don't know if this is context that people already know about, but really the open science movement happened in the early to mid 2010s when there was this kind of reproducibility crisis. Term reproducibility crisis, I think, dates back to the 2010s. There was a high-profile paper in Nature or Science or a journal like that, where it was looking at 100 empirical psychology papers and tried to replicate the findings of them, and they found that only in this alarmingly small share of them did the findings replicate. And that was for lots of things that led to kind of open and transparent methods. The fact that, you know, they don't all publish their data, they don't all publish kind of the methods and code which allow them to generate the results, but also a lot of it related to the kind of way in which the people who were publishing were doing their data analysis. So people will have heard of the term p-hacking, where you get a data set and you explore it in lots of different ways and selectively focus on parts of the data set and ways of cutting the data in a way that manipulates effect sizes so that you can publish things that look like they're statistically significant. So that's kind of p-hacking. Another term that kind of is adjacent is the forking paths problem. And this is a paper that actually even now has a Wikipedia page that came out a few years ago by Andrew Gelman, who's a famous kind of statistical practice person, sort of political scientist, but he's also a statistician. And it's kind of a slightly different take on the p-hacking thing, where it's not kind of nefarious, this idea of like, you know, kind of coming up with p-values that are slightly biased because of the way that the data is being manipulated. So you could start, and often it's the case that people who are doing kind of good, transparent research kind of start with good intentions. But there are loads of decisions when you do real data analysis around the treatment of variables, the transformations that you perform on them, you know, the class of models that you use that might be as a result of kind of the academic tradition that you're from, plus heuristics, plus some other things. And basically, there are all these forking paths that you could take within a data analysis, and like decisions that are well justified upstream may have like unintended consequences downstream. So you could end up with very partial or slightly kind of biased findings and p-values and other things as a result of these kind of unintended decisions. You can't chart every path that you could take through a data analysis. People who've, I don't know if you've heard the term multiverse analysis, but that's one solution that I don't think really works for the forking paths problem. So as a consequence of that, not only is sort of open science protocols in terms of making your code transparent and data open and those types of things, there is a kind of recipe for doing data analysis that has been advocated. I realize it's 5.2, so I need to speed up a bit. Which is this. So you start off with a data set, you do some exploratory analysis on it, not much, because that could pollute your confirmatory data analysis, the real data analysis that happens downstream. Then you stop, pre-register. So we've talked about the term of pre-registration. This is where you map out all of the analysis that you're going to do. I'm going to test these hypotheses. I'm going to do it on this data set, which has this sample size, and it has this approximate incident rates in the population, which means I can do this power analysis and say these are the effect sizes that I'm going to expect. And then basically you spec everything out in advance, and then you press a button, the analysis is run, and then all of your knowledge can be kind of gained from clicking that run button, and that's your analysis. I'm deliberately kind of couching it in a particular way. So we started to do that with this road safety data set. We thought, well, let's try and do a pre-registration analysis on this data set, because we had real things that we wanted to evaluate. But very quickly we realized that this model locked us into quite a narrow form of analysis. That we could easily do a pre-registration on many things. We're looking at sort of the effect of auto-obesity on injury severity over time. So we set a pre-registration report around that. But then very quickly we realized that there was lots of context that would inform some of the effects that we're observing. And actually, if you think about it, road crashes happen in a particular. There's lots of context basically that happens around these road crashes, and we were coming up with null hypotheses which just kind of weren't capturing sufficiently. They were too reductive. They weren't capturing that context in a good way, and so this model is too narrow for many of the use cases that we have, certainly here, but also in, I think, geography and adjacent domains more generally. And I'm not the only person who's thought that. So there are lots of this sort of great and the good of statistical practice and also the open science movement who've been questioning, whether or not things like pre-registration really guarantee good empirical science. And sort of lamenting the kind of devaluing of exploratory research. And so the question then is, if exploratory research, especially in kind of modern data analysis use cases where you're repurposing data sets, you're not using kind of experimental research, looking at, I don't know, the effect of statins on blood pressure. So really quite kind of definable things. A lot of data science research involves repurposing data and seeing whether you could use it to kind of investigate kind of real observations in society. That in those circumstances, exploratory research becomes really, really important. Can we do it in a way that is rigorous, that's slightly more formal, that's not leading to kind of dodgy scientific practices that kind of provokes the scientific reform movement and reproducibility crisis in the first place? And so I went back to the data set and then basically wrote a kind of it's a bit of a framework paper, but it's also got some examples in it for how we could kind of leverage modern statistical techniques and graphics and other things to do this exploratory research in a slightly more rigorous way. And then that led to a project that I was working on last year and still am. So this is the tension that I'm interested in, how to do good research that's rigorous, but also involves kind of richness. And we had this, I realized I've got 1 minute left. We had this project with Turing that was doing that very thing. And there are outputs, people can contact me later, that we're working on at the moment, where we're coming up with protocols, ideas, we're designing notebook environments to kind of formalize the exploratory analysis process somewhat. We've also got an upcoming special issue where we're saying what this could look like for different domains. So for ecology, for transport research I'm involved in, for political science. So that's happening. And the final thing that I do want to say in the 30 seconds that we have left is that that's happening outside of Leeds. Within Leeds, we at LIDA have this Science for Data Science program that we're launching in June, which has people who know more about this than me. So that Peter Tennant is like a causal inference person you might have heard of, doing great stuff in sort of epidemiology. And Jose Pina Sanchez is a criminologist who works on kind of doing meta-science research with lots of interesting kind of sentencing data and other things. So we're putting together a group to discuss these very issues. We're going to have a few kind of invited talks and other things and meet a few times a year. So if you want to engage with this from LIDA, then that's the vehicle to do it as well. So I'm sorry that I've used up too much time there. But,
well, it wasn't your fault, Roger. I think we all overran slightly, but and I'm conscious people will have other meetings to get to. There weren't too many questions coming in. I mean, I'm really interested in your work. I mean, I'm always staggered by how many different perspectives there are happening. And as I sort of keep saying, I'm certainly not a disciplinary expert, and trying to keep a handle on all the different sort of angles to this is a full-time job, which is good because that's what I've got. But the only question we did get, and I will pick up that with, I'd be really interested to talk to you, Eric, in more detail about that, because I know that Kikachukwu said a go at answering that, but the short answer is we don't know, and I suppose that's what we'd like to talk to you as someone working in that domain, might be able to sort of help us to understand what open research might be in that context. And it is problematic. It's come from this sense of reproducible research, which isn't, as I said earlier, always relevant in every discipline. But thanks to our speakers, that was really interesting. And the main thing that I'd like to get from this and future talks is a growing community, so we haven't much time for questions today, but that doesn't mean you can't contact our speakers or myself or Kikachukwu. And as I say, we're very happy to come and speak to people in more details. We're always learning, different aspects of this. And the open thing as well, that was one question I did just want to ask. I'm conscious we've overrun, but the very concept of open, I think, can be problematic sometimes. So some of the stuff that you were talking about, Myles, are you still there? I'm not sure if you had to run. Yeah, he's still there.
I'm here.
So we tend to try and talk more about open and fair data, so there's a lot of governance been developed around data that can't necessarily be fully open, but it can still be shared. So sometimes I think the word open in itself can be problematic. So there's lots of nuance and things to discuss around there, but unfortunately we've run out of time today. So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to our speakers. I think you'll both be able to share your slides with us, will you, Roger and Myles?
Yeah, there's nothing. I've got my acknowledgement on that slide that's needed.
Yeah, and I always write up a bit of a blog post and post it on the library blog with a recording of this event as well. So keep an eye out for that. And please get in touch. So thanks everybody, and go and enjoy the sun. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Thanks.
I never shut the room quite straight up. You wouldn't, it feels a bit rude just to slam the door on everybody. So I'll just give it a few minutes where people go. But thanks, Myles.
Bye.